Principles. Sebastian Wick, the stage is yours.
Thank you. All right, so this talk is going to be about basically the work I did on portals over the last half year or so, where I was basically improving the testing infrastructure. I have a whole section about portals here, but it seems kind of pointless given the audience here right now. But anyway, basically portals, the project exists for a few years now. It's being used a lot, and basically it's APIs for applications to use. It's a bunch of debug services at the end of the day. They're exposed at a certain name, and yeah, I guess we all know what they are. They're available on GitHub, and there's also nice documentation for it, which is also great. So yeah, they are all, the portals are a session service, and they expose the APIs via debug interfaces. The nice parts about it is everything is desktop agnostic because they have different backends. And the other really great part about portals is that they work for sandbox applications, which is thank you. So it works for sandbox applications, and it also works for non-sandbox applications, and that is really the key part here. Another nice part about the portal APIs is that they kind of give the user control over everything. There's a whole permission system. And essentially, like, if you're an application developers, you should use portals. Like, that's just, they are great APIs. Like, it's how we expose stuff from the system to applications. And yeah, you really should just use them. Now, to understand like all the testing stuff, I'm also going to explain a bit how portals like work. Essentially, the XDG desktop portal project, there are three kind of binaries and services which are running. The one is the XDG desktop portal itself, then there's the XDG permission store and the document portal. They all expose like some of their functionality via dbus, and the document portal also has a Fuse file system that is exposed. The Fuse file system and some part of the dbus API are getting exposed to all applications, all the sandbox ones and the not sandbox ones. The XDG desktop portal does a bunch of things. The first one is that it authenticates the caller, so it will figure out who's like calling the functionality there. Like, for example, which flatpak application and instance is calling it, and depending on it, it can make like security decisions. It also validates input. It talks with the permission store. It does a bunch of work which is like agnostic to the actual like desktop environment, and then whenever it's required, it calls into like desktop specific backends. And then at the end we have a bunch of like those desktop specific backends which usually show some kind of UI, but they can also do some other like not UI related tasks. Whatever is like desktop specific basically. So, like, essentially we have, like, this is the kind of the whole system working. On the one end, we have like, the application itself, and it talks with like the Fuse, like it talks with the desktop portal thing. It sometimes uses the Fuse file system. In some circumstances, it also calls like the document portal directly, but like, yeah. There's also some configuration involved, like, you have to configure it in a certain way for it to be set up correctly for the desktop environment that you're using, and then it will automatically like pick the right backends. In this case, for example, you have GDK and GNOME backends being used, whereas like the KDE one might be installed on the system but not used on the current session. There are also like some conventions of how the APIs look like for the portals, their requests and sessions, and essentially it's a way around trying to, essentially there could be timeouts when like there's a request coming into a backend. So we kind of have a method call, and that creates an object, and the object delivers like the result at the end, and sessions are kind of a long-living version of the same thing. Right, so when I started like improving things, the first thing that I noticed was that the good part here is that there are existing tests. Like, that's always great. Like, there was at least some testing being done, and that's really important, but there were also a bunch of like missing parts. So the tests that we had, they were all using the glib testing framework, and it kind of makes sense because glib is C-based, and all the portal stuff is also, they're all written in C. There are also two kinds of tests, I guess. One of them are unit tests, which just check like certain functions. They just run tests on the functions, like they give the function some input and test output, like pretty straightforward stuff. But the more interesting ones are the integration tests, because they basically run the whole thing, and then they hammer, like they use the API and look at the backends and at other things to figure out if everything actually works in the way one would expect it to work. So that's what I'm focusing on here, and that's where my work focused on as well. So essentially what we want to test are like the three kind of boxes here, like the actual products of like the XDG desktop portal project, which is the actual portals, the permission store, and like the document portal again with the Fuse file system maybe. And the tests basically looked like this, where we replaced the application with like the test itself. Then there are API calls being made to the portal itself, and the portal then in turn will call into a mocked version of a backend. And the integration tests again will communicate with the mocked tests, mocked backends to figure out if like everything, worked as expected. Right, they communicate the test and the mock backend. They kind of communicated via some like kind of ini file format thing. The tests were written in C, and so were the backends. We also used libportal in the tests to kind of use the portal API instead of calling dbus directly, just because calling dbus directly is sometimes a bit of a hassle, especially in C. And we also had kind of a so one issue with the libportal thing is that it kind of created a weird cyclic dependency where we wanted to add a new portal, and then we wanted to add tests. But if we want to use libportal in the tests, then the code has already to be in libportal, but they don't want to merge things when they are not already in the portals. So it wasn't great. And another thing is that like the CI was not doing very well. Like, it was not maintained properly, and like it was a like multiple years old Ubuntu version, the image was running. So yeah, also not good. Then we also have some Python tests in there actually for the integration tests. That's work started by Peter Hatterer. It's using the PyTest framework, and it uses dbus mock for mocking the backends instead of like writing the mocking the mock backends in C. There's also like some utilities to just make interacting with the portals a bit easier, so that like libportal isn't needed anymore, and we can just write Python. Some of the tests were then written in with this PyTest framework, but unfortunately it didn't really catch on. Like, some new portals were added, and they added C tests again. But it was also kind of understandable because like the testing harness wasn't doing, it had some problems and wasn't that easy to use, and like debugging it was kind of a pain. So there was a lot you could improve. But first of all, like if you want to test things, the important part is actually running the test. So like the first thing I basically did is like upgrade the CI and try to make sure that everything is working again there, so we can actually run the tests all the time whenever we commit and push. And it's working. Like we are using the new CI now for quite a while. It's kind of like it's running on GitHub, which means like we don't have the typical like free desktop org kind of CI way, but I kind of replicated that so that we can build a container on demand and with tags. So yeah, it's working. It does all the right things, like the image is described as a container file. We run, like we build everything, and we also run the tests, which is like the important part here. It also builds the docs and the website, and we also now have a release workflow, which means making releases is easier now. So what I did to the integration tests then was basically that I started to isolate everything more properly. Like one of the things is that it's creating temp directory, and then we're creating directories in there so that like all the environment is set up in such a way that it's pointing to this temp directory, and the tests don't interfere with each other. I made it possible that the Python test can now like start not just the document, not just the XGG tester portal, but also the document portal and the permission store. We are running address sanitizer on it now, which means that whenever there's like some memory leak, the CI will catch it and the test will fail. And we found like somewhere between 10 and 20 like memory leaks with that, just by running the tests and expanding the Python tests then on different portals. Yes, you can now also run the Python tests with multiple backends, which is something that is required for some portals, because they use, for example, the access portal and at the access backend another backend at the same time. So that was also not possible, and that's now working. I improved the overall the foundation that Peter Hutter laid with the PyTest setup, and I made sure that it's using fixtures and it's making everything more flexible, allowing tests to override stuff. We also added support for umocdev, which is like a library which is mocking everything that's like in /dev, which means that we could mock devices, for example, for the new USB portal. It's also now possible to kind of configure the portal in one of the tests, which we're using, for example, to test the settings portal, because there you might want to have different backends configured at the same time, and they all influence the settings that come out at the end. And we can now also, which is really quite cool, we can now pretend that the tests are either flatpaks or snaps or the host, which means that we are really, before that we kind of pretended that everything is a host, all the tests are running on the host, and that kind of limited our tests to yeah. So that was kind of a blind spot that we can also be fixed then. The testing utils were improved. There were some races in the tests, which is always kind of a problem when you're saying do a certain thing and then wait some amount of time and then check the result. But now it's actually waiting until the thing changed. So the tests are not racy anymore. And then I ported over most of the tests. Not most of them, all of them. There's literally no, I took all of the C tests, I ported them over to the Python harnessed. There were some odd cases in there as well, because the Fuse file system had different tests, but overall I managed to push everything over to the Python framework, and it was like quite nice at the end. And then we dropped the C integration tests in the next release, which was merged in February and is like 12,000 lines of code that we could remove. And now it's more looking like this, which looks much closer to like how it looks in practice. Like the Python test harness, it can pretend to be flatpak, snap, or host. We can spawn the permission store, the document portal. We can have multiple backends, and we can change the config. So everything that you would expect and like in the actual system is actually being tested now. Yeah, I mean, I could go over some of the details. How am I doing on time? 5. Perfect. Let's see, like how this looks now in Python, and especially like what I'm using here is the PyTest framework. And there you can just basically define a test, and it looks like this is one of the simpler tests, but it's a complete test. Like we define the test version. And then we have a like utility which will then call a specific portal, in this instance the print portal, and will check that the version of the print portal is like 3, which is the current portal version. Interesting part about this is that the arguments to the test version function, they are fixtures, so they come from our test harness. For example, the fact that the second argument is portals means that we are spawning XDG desktop portal, and dbus_con is like a mocked or a nested kind of dbus session on which we spawned the portal, which means that then check version can on this nested dbus connection where we have spawned the portal can then do the dbus calls and check the version. And this is a more like realistic thing, where we like create a request for a specific functionality in the print portal, and then we can like quite easily just with a helper call the thing, get a response, check the response, then call into the mocked backend and see like with the get method calls. We can basically look at what the backend got, and we can check, okay, the prepare print in the backend was called one time, and there are certain arguments, and then we could go on to check that the arguments are as we expected. The fixtures are quite nice because every test can override them. So for example, the printing tests have this defined at the top level of the class, which means this is like defined for a whole bunch of printing tests, which is basically saying when you run those tests, we need the print portal and the lockdown portal backends. So it will automatically spawn those backends with certain parameters. We can also, at a specific test, override one of the fixtures again. In this case, we are saying that now, in this case, we want the lockdown portal, the lockdown backend that we are mocking to disable printing, which means this entire test is now running with printing disabled, and the tests will therefore behave differently than if we didn't do that. So we can like check basically all the different combinations of things that are possible. What we also can do is like create configurations. This is, for example, from the settings portal, where we have a Python generator which yields different configurations, and all of them are supposed to work. Like they are all like configurations which should work. And in the test, we just parameterize one of the fixtures with this generator, and that gets us, like, the test is then being run multiple times. For each of the configurations that we are yielding, this test is being run, and we are checking that all the configuration is as we expect with all the good ones. And similarly, we have configurations which are bad, which are supposed to fail, and we have a test which then checks that all these things should fail. And the other interesting part here is that we create, like, to make sure that we test everything as a snap pack, as a flatpak, as a snap, and as a host. There's a fixture which has parameters, and that means that basically everything that uses the XDB app info fixture, which is auto use, so every test will use them, it will create like an app info for the test so that the portal recognizes it as one of the things. And in turn, that means all the tests are by default run 3 times, each time with a different kind of pretend test kind. Yeah, and I think that is basically everything I wanted to show you here. It's just some work that at the end of the day, we managed to find a whole bunch of bugs with it, and it's made everything much more stable. Like, hopefully will make things more stable in the future. People have been writing new tests in this PyTest framework now, which is great. So overall, I would say this was like time well spent. I would still hope that we can, for example, now that the tests are working really well, it means that we could also, in the future, if we wanted to, because they're all integration tests, we could replace parts of like XDG desktop portal. We write it in other languages if we wanted to, and the tests would still be able to work, which I think is a great way of like, of maybe replacing parts of something that might be in need of replacing. But yeah, that's everything. Thank you.